Think back to a moment in time when a single massive wave of music, fashion, and film completely rewrote the DNA of an entire nation's pop culture. We're talking about the mid-1960s, when a multi-front cultural takeover permanently altered modern entertainment. You know it as the British invasion. In this explainer, we're going to break down exactly how this happened, step by digging into the data, the events, and the massive cultural shifts that defined a whole era. Okay, let's dive right in. Just listen to this punchy quote from Life magazine back in early 1964. In 1776, England lost her American colonies. Last week, the Beatles took them back. I mean, that perfectly captures the colossal scale of the phenomenon we are unpacking here. This wasn't just some new band getting popular. It was literally viewed by the media and the public as an absolute conquest. It was a cultural tsunami that completely overwhelmed the American entertainment landscape. Section 1. The spark of Beatlemania. So, picture late 1963. American youth were getting kinda tired of the clean-cut pop idols of the time, like Fabian and Bobby Darin. There was a void, and it was about to be filled incredibly fast. In November, you start seeing the first U.S. news articles and TV spots about this British frenzy called Beatlemania. Then, in December, a 15-year-old girl from Maryland named Marcia Albert sees a news report and actually writes to a local Washington, D.C. radio station, basically asking, hey, why can't we have music like that? So the DJ plays I Wanna Hold Your Hand, the phone lines absolutely light up, and the record spreads like wildfire. By late January, it hits #1. This wasn't a slow build at all. Actually, scratch that. It was a complete and total explosion. And that explosion culminated in one mind-blowing number, 73 million. On Sunday, February 9th, 1964, the Beatles appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, and 73 million people tuned in. To put that into perspective for a second, that is like drawing modern Super Bowl-level viewership for a simple band performance. It represented a staggering 45% of all American television viewers that night. It's kind of funny to think that the single biggest moment in the history of popular music was first experienced in the U.S. as a cozy living room television event. But let me tell you, the impact of that broadcast was anything but quiet. Because that television spark immediately translated into totally unprecedented chart domination. By April 4th, 1964, the Beatles held the top 5 positions on the Billboard Hot 100 simultaneously. Top 5, something no other act had ever done. They locked down the #1 spot for 14 straight weeks. And get this, they had an unbelievable 30 different listings on the Hot 100 in just a single year. They completely rewrote the record books overnight. Section 2. Beyond the Fab Four. Now, if it had just been the Beatles, we'd probably just call it a fad. But an entire industry rushed right through the door they opened. Literally just 1 week after the Beatles entered the Hot 100, Dusty Springfield hit #12 with I Only Want to Be With You. Then came the Rolling Stones, who would go on to top the chart 8 times. It was a total industry-wide takeover. By May of 1965, if you looked at the Billboard Top 10, UK artists held 8 of the top 9 spots. American radio was just completely saturated with British accents and British sounds. But within the invasion itself, there was this fascinating clash of styles. It's like a giant puzzle with 2 completely different types of pieces. On one side, you had the polished, parent-friendly pop style, bands like the Beatles, the Hollies, and the Zombies. But then, on the other side, you had this gritty, blues-based style, bands like the Rolling Stones, the Animals, and the Kinks. These groups were actively reviving musical genres rooted deeply in American blues and rhythm and blues, which really appealed to a much more outsider, rebellious teenage demographic. Because the Beatles set that initial template, the American music industry often tried to force every single British band into that same squeaky clean mold. Eric Burdon, from the gritty blues band The Animals, actually recalled this friction. He said, "They dressed us up in the most strange costumes. We were just pushed around and told, when you arrive in America, don't mention the Vietnam War." It perfectly highlights that clash between the raw reality of these blues bands and the sanitized, heavily choreographed image the industry expected them to play along with. Section 3. A total cultural takeover. And it didn't stop at the radio. The musical invasion opened the floodgates for British actors and aesthetics to completely dominate American screens. Over in film, Julie Andrews became absolute movie royalty with Mary Poppins, Audrey Hepburn charmed everyone in My Fair Lady, and Sean Connery defined the ultimate action hero as James Bond. On television, British spy series like Danger Man and The Avengers were massive hits, inspiring a whole wave of American copycats. Astoundingly, 4 of the 1960s Best Picture Oscar winners were British productions. Plus, you simply can't talk about the 1960s without talking about fashion.
The visual culture was entirely transformed by the swinging London mod scene. Designers like Mary Quant introduced the miniskirt, and early supermodels like Twiggy and Jean Shrimpton became global icons overnight. They completely challenged the conventional conservative American clothing styles of the time. For American teenagers and young adults, it was pretty simple. If it wasn't British, it wasn't hip. The whole standard of style had essentially shifted across the Atlantic.
Section 4. The American musical response. So with the UK dominating everywhere you looked, there's this really common myth that 1964 just spelled the end for American artists. But we really need to ask, did the British invasion actually destroy American music? Well, let's look at the facts. The truth is, the impact on domestic music was pretty mixed. Yes, for certain genres like instrumental surf music and those squeaky clean teen idols of the 1950s, their popularity absolutely plummeted. But Black American artists, particularly Motown acts like the Supremes, the Temptations, and Stevie Wonder, they actually thrived. They reached massive new heights right at the exact same time as the invasion. And established stars like the Beach Boys and Elvis Presley, they either adapted and continued their success, or they just saw a temporary dip before bouncing right back. The American reaction to all this was dual, and honestly, sometimes quite comical. On one hand, you had imitation as flattery. American bands were adopting British-sounding names just to trick audiences, groups like the San Francisco-based Boo Brummels or the Tex-Mex act Sir Douglas Quintet. But on the other hand, you had this very literal patriotic pushback. Garage rock bands like Paul Revere and the Raiders were dressing up in actual American Revolutionary War uniforms, while Gary Puckett wore Civil War gear. It was a literal, visual, and musical battle for the youth of America.
Section 5. Legacy of the invasion.
Ultimately, the British invasion wasn't just some fleeting trend. It fundamentally rewired the entertainment industry forever. And we can boil that down to 3 structural changes. First, it internationalized the production of rock and roll. It proved for sure that musical creativity wasn't just restricted to American shores. Second, it famously took American blues and R&B, which had been largely ignored by the mainstream when performed by Black American artists in the 50s, and it repackaged it, reviving it for a massive new youth audience. And third, and maybe most importantly, it cemented the modern concept of the self-contained rock group. Before this, singers sang and studio musicians played the instruments. The British invasion normalized the whole idea that a band should actually play their own guitars and drums and write their own material. Which brings us to our final thought today. By cementing this modern concept of the self-contained songwriting rock band, did the British invasion lay the blueprint for every single musical revolution that followed? Think about it. From punk to grunge to indie rock, the DNA of that 1964 British invasion is still entirely visible today. It completely changed how we dress, what we watch, and absolutely what we listen to. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. And remember to keep questioning the history behind the pop culture you love.